everyone. Happy New Hour. We hope you're having a wonderful muggy day from DC, but I can see we're San Jose. Oh, Mojave Desert. Wonderful. I think I've been so far everywhere that's been mentioned, which makes me want to travel really soon. I do hope you're having a wonderful day from wherever you are joining us from. My name is Susan Gerber-Burning, and I am the Interim Executive Director at the Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House. We're a historic site located in Alexandria, Virginia. As a historic venue, telling the full and truthful history of the site is core to our mission. And so you will continue to see programs and activity related to untold or underrepresented stories, as well as other important themes. You can view our interpretation priorities through a link on our homepage of our website. We are a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and this property is home to 2 historic homes and a farm. One of the homes on the site is the iconic Frank Lloyd Wright Pope-Leighey House, and the other is Woodlawn, which was formerly a plantation that was originally part of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Its owner, Nellie Custis Lewis, who was the step-granddaughter of George Washington, together with her husband, enslaved over 90 people between 1805 and 1839. Nellie was one of America's foremost needleworkers, and as a plantation site, running a plantation site, she benefited by significant contributions of the enslaved people who historically were weavers, spinners, and quilters, as well as labored on the site. And this allowed Nellie the luxury of working on her needlework craft. At the site this month, we are hosting the 58th Annual Needlework Show with hundreds of brilliant needlework pieces displayed throughout the house, many of which correspond to our theme of Hindsight 2020, Needlework Expressions of a Historic Year, where the artists have used art to express their thoughts, emotions, and feelings of this unprecedented time. Our site is also home to the Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture. This is a farm that is dedicated to creating more equitable and sustainable food system locally here in the Washington, D.C. area, and is relevant to our site's history of freed Black cultivation communities, cooperative farming, and equitable farming. During this session, please do keep your microphones muted, your cameras off, but if your cameras or microphones do happen to come on accidentally, just be aware that we will be using this, this recording on our website so others can view it. Feel free to doodle, walk around. This is this entire month about art and how it affects us and how we can speak through it. So we do hope that you pick up a crayon or a pencil or needlepoint or something to do during the presentation. For best viewing, I do recommend that you change your screen to speaker view. You can do this by clicking View on the top right of your screen and selecting Side-by-Side Speaker. We will facilitate a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but do feel free to add your questions into the chat. Look at where your chat button is and get used to that. And please feel free to put your questions in, where you're from, how you heard about this program. So now I'm pleased to introduce Lauren Leon. Lauren is a board-certified art therapist and licensed mental health counselor in Boston, Massachusetts. She's an assistant professor of art therapy at Lesley University and an editor of the book Craft in Art Therapy: Diverse Approaches to the Transformative Power of Craft Materials and Methods. She is an active artist working on personal and collaborative art projects, some of which she will be discussing during this presentation. Lauren has a strong interest in researching the unique therapies and benefits of using crafting for art therapy practice and how craft activism can support art therapy. Lauren, thank you for joining us today, and the time is yours until 45 minutes after the hour, so 12:45, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks so much, Susan and Trinity and all the folks at Woodlawn Pope-Leighey House for having me. And also thank you for everyone here watching. Hope you have your sandwich ready. If it's your lunch hour, this will be pretty informal. Thanks so much for joining. And Susan, thanks for contextualizing us by talking about the history of Woodlawn. And I just want to, in that spirit, name that I'm on land. I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm on the land of Massachusetts people, and also want to acknowledge their neighbors, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag people. So I am an art therapist, I'm a crafter, and I have been really interested in looking at how art therapy, craft, and activism intersect in my research. And the focus of this talk will be looking at that in the context of the last year, year and a half. So I'm going to start by just grounding us a little bit with some common language. So if you're not familiar, art therapy is a distinct mental health discipline that incorporates the use of art media and creative processes and product to promote well-being. So art can be used for expression, to make meaning, for community building, and even for activism. And so some things that we believe in art therapy is that everyone is inherently creative, that engaging in creativity is healthy, it feels good. It can help us make sense of our worlds, heal from pain, understand and communicate our lived experiences. It can be used individually or in community as ritual, can be used for relaxation, and that art therapy is metaverbal, which means it's beyond words, and that can help us express our felt experience, our lived experience better than words sometimes. I also want to start with a working definition of craft. So we'll be talking specifically about textiles today, but here are two quotes that I really feel embody how I view the intersections of craft, art therapy, and activism. So sociologist and media theorist David Gauntlet has this quote: "Craft is the inherent satisfaction of making, the sense of being alive within the process, and the engagement with ideas, learning, and knowledge would come not before or after, but within the practice of making." And I really like that because I think it embodies a lot of what we consider art therapy to do. And then also this quote about this vision of craft as power, right? The ability or capacity to act, and emphasizing the potential of craft practices for social and political action. And so that's something I'd like you to keep in mind today too, as we look at how individuals and communities have used textiles in the last year, year and a half. So how do art therapy and textiles relate? Well, many people have been researching this recently. Art therapists, health psychologists, clinical psychologists, occupational therapists have looked at the impact of making textiles on individuals and groups. And much of the research has focused on how textiles can support people in working through trauma. And that feels particularly salient right now after a year plus of pandemic. As well as racial uprisings and everything else, a polarizing election, everything that's been happening in the last 18 years. So first I want to look a little bit at the individual level and how textiles can have therapeutic benefits, and then we'll look at a community level. But in terms of individual level, one thing that comes up again and again in research is this importance of engaging sensory and kinesthetic experience and the medium's relational and soothing nature. The fact that we're using both hands, so it's a bilateral stimulation of our brain functions, and can serve an integrating function when people recount traumatic experiences or working through difficult emotional content. Textiles have been shown to support affect regulation, to help manage anxiety, to promote relaxation. Often working in textiles is a slow process, and so that gives us time to slow down and kind of reflect and move through working through difficult emotions. Textiles have been shown to support mood improvement that persists, not just that doesn't just occur while we're creating, but beyond. So this idea of rejuvenation, that the improved mood persists beyond the time that you're creating. Researchers have looked at increased self-esteem and also how that relates to a sense of mastery and learning new skills, and also restoring a sense of control, right? And that there can be a sense of psychological safety, because craft and textiles are usually media that aren't analyzed or judged based on their merits of aesthetic quality as much as fine arts. And so that can decrease sort of inhibition in creating and support a creative process more naturally. That textiles can help contain and externalize feelings. And I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. that they can help restore connection to cultural traditions, that they help us in recognizing and communicating our social, cultural, and political realities. And so these fit together with these images on the right here. There is this kind of floppy guy called Albie that has 2 legs and 2 balls. His head's kind of flopped over, and then an image of a jellyfish that are crocheted. These were created by art therapist Marilyn Holmes, and she's a Black woman who used this process that she created herself to contain and externalize the racial battle fatigue that she was experiencing in her training and also work as an art therapist, and to manage microaggressions. So she would crochet these pieces. She would write things within them. She added denim so that they were heavier, so they kind of had a weight, and it was her way of getting things outside of herself and to get a little bit of distance. So I think that's a really beautiful example of a way that textiles are used in self-care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the community benefits of textiles as well, right? So there's a really long history of craft being a community practice. And there's this idea that craft has a social power, right? That it involves socializing, collective activity, and it can serve as a source for solidarity. It can be an opportunity for sharing experiences and storytelling. One thing I've found as an art therapist when I work in groups and communities is that when we are using fine arts media, often people are pretty quiet and focused inward. And when we're using crafting, especially textiles, there's often more conversation, a lot of skill sharing, a lot of storytelling. People connect it to how they learned to craft, who taught them. That often relates to family and culture. And so there's just more discussion. So there can be this mutual support and social connection that arises out of that. Group validation for individual experiences, and that can result in reducing social stigma. Craft can be used as an awareness raising tool in communities and groups, and can even be a method of resisting social and political oppression, and also a form of community care. So on the right is this photograph of hand braces created by Sandy Yee, who is an art therapist and disability activist. And she created these braces for her friend as a form of moving out of self-care and a sort of neoliberal idea that we all need to take care of ourselves so that we can be productive and contribute to society, and that it's on each of us, to taking care of each other. And what does it mean for people to engage in collective care? And so she created these braces, and they have these beautiful little French knots in like these nice pink and red and sort of tan colors to support her friend's hands in a position that was comfortable for her, rather than something that was based on fixing an issue, and as a form of witnessing and supporting her friend. So now I want to talk just briefly about craftivism. So certainly throughout history, people have used craft to express themselves, to build community, even to resist social and political oppression. But this term craftivism was originated in 2003 by Betsy Greer. Some other terms that relate are social practice, participatory textile making, and this movement has been tied to several social and political movements. And there are these commonalities in projects, that there's a participatory element, a democratic process, that cross-disciplinary media is used. So often there's a virtual element, a digital element, as well as the analog crafting piece, and a mission for political engagement. So in my research as an art therapist, I really wanted to look at craft activism and what that meant in art therapy practice. So I'm going to talk just briefly about my research and the findings, and then we'll get into talking about some of the projects that folks have been engaging in the last year that are really interesting. So I wanted to look at how craft activism supports art therapy participants in community-based settings in being agents of social change. So how can the community use art to name, explore, and affect change on issues that impact them? So here's our group. We called ourselves Crafting Change. We all identified as women. We hold a range of racial and ethnic identities. Many of the group are elders. Many of the group are of lower socioeconomic status. And we started in 2017. Our plan was to meet for about 4 months in a community health center in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. And we collaboratively created a quilt that aimed to raise community awareness and as a call to action to folks in the community around the gentrification and displacement that was impacting the neighborhood. And so this is a neighborhood that has a rich history of arts and culture, jazz clubs, public art, grassroots activism. Also, it is a neighborhood that has the second highest rate of mental health hospitalizations among Boston's neighborhoods and is impacted by poverty and community violence. So we got together and started talking about craft and craft activism. We decided to make a quilt because specifically of the connections to African American heritage and the cultural resonance that this held for most of the group. And so here are a couple of squares. And so as we quilted, we used discussion, we used storytelling, and the art making process to reflect collectively, focusing on how displacement is impacting the community and especially elders. And so the imagery and the words that emerged from this quilt included buildings like jazz clubs. So on the left, you see this photo transfer of a club called Connolly's that one of our members then embroidered on. On the right is a square that says, where do we go from here? We can't live here anymore. And then it says, why? Money. And so we just were engaging in conversation about changes in the neighborhood and what we thought was what they were related to. Here are a couple more squares. On the left is a square by Leslie that has an undershirt that was her mother's that had a lot of meaning for her as a way of memorializing her mother, but also that her mother was a source of where she learned to be an activist. On the right, the phrase, we all have to be part of the solution. This means all for one and one for all. And so as we made this quilt over the 4 months, we decided to organize a traveling exhibit so the quilt could be seen by as many people as possible. And so we really started to strategize about who to invite to these events based on who would benefit from hearing this call to action, but also who had institutional power, who could potentially ally with us to help affect policy about development in the neighborhood. So after we made the quilt, and as we were making, we had these critical dialogue circles where we were engaged in reflection about our art making process and discussion and what we learned from it. And then also what it was like to share the quilt in a range of settings. And these are the impacts that we found. And so these are things that it's not automatically transferable to any craftivism project, but when I look at craftivism projects, I wonder about these things. So on the individual level, the project really supported participants in creating a sense of agency through instilling a new or renewed sense of awakening, motivation to contribute, building a feeling of pride, offering sensory and symbolic benefits through the craft medium. It created a strength-based environment. So on the group level, we were looking at authentic and trusting relationships that developed, that we shared leadership and made decisions on consensus, that as a group, people felt a greater sense of purpose. And also that collaboration became a really important part of the process. And so what was interesting was that when we first started, everyone was kind of doing a little bit of everything. And then by the end of making this quilt, folks were really focusing on their particular skills. And so people started sort of unofficially being assigned roles as like, oh, you're really good at this. Will you do this part? Or will you teach me how to do this? So collaboration became a really important part of what we were doing. And also this community level, that the quilt allowed the group to be heard by their own community and also communities that might not ordinarily listen to them. So we were invited. It seemed like the quilt acted as this sort of intermediary, or like a passport into spaces that we might not have been invited into or noticed in ordinarily. And also served as a way to multiply and disseminate the knowledge that our group generated over the course of the project. So the project stopped after our data analysis officially, but we continue to meet 4 years later, which is really special. And we've continued to present this quilt in a range of settings. So we presented it at, for example, the Fuller Craft Museum in Brockton, to art therapy classes at a university, a senior group at the YMCA, the Museum of the National Center for Afro-American Art, which is also in Roxbury. And we also had an offer to show it at Boston City Hall. And we're still meeting. We're working on another quilt that honors women of color who have been significant contributors to history, ranging in chronology from, I think, Ida B. Wells is probably one of the oldest, to looking at contemporary leaders like AOC, for example. And yeah, and so we've had to take a break, unfortunately, because of COVID. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, and sort of the assumptions we've had that everything's happening online right now, and that's not true for everyone. But once we get together, once we're meeting again, hopefully this summer, we're going to finish up this quilt, and then we plan to partner with organizations where we feel exhibiting the quilt will provide educational and inspirational purposes. So to summarize, these are what we found as therapeutic benefits of craft activism. And so I don't have time to go into each of these right now, but the one that I really want to highlight that stood out for most of us, or I think for everyone the most, was this idea of being awakened and awakening others. And so through this project, people reported that they woke themselves up. Our goal was to wake other people up, like pay attention to what's happening here. And people felt like through this process, they woke themselves up. And so they recognized that they had something important to say. They had this increased personal drive and motivation to contribute more to the community. And that was coupled with a sense of agency to do so. And by focusing on the process of sharing a call to action with their community, people felt that they were compelled and motivated into action as well. So in sum, what we found was that in a community model of art therapy, collaborative craft activism built individuals' capacity to address issues that affect their communities, and that developing those skills also served a therapeutic function. So I'm going to shift gears now and start talking a little bit about the last year, but keeping all of this in mind as we look at what the last year has been like, right? So what have we felt in 2020, 2021? And this is by no means the full list, but just the things that I've seen most commonly. And I was looking at information from the National Institute of Mental Health that came out in April 2021. So it was looking at a year into the pandemic. What do we know? And based on surveys collected by the CDC, there's been a substantial increase in self-reported behavioral health symptoms. And they're nearly double the rates that we would have expected before the pandemic. And of course, it's important to note that, as often is the case, the more vulnerable among us are also people feeling mental health impacts more intensely, right? And so we can look at job loss, housing instability, food insecurity, risk factors for COVID, as well as what's been going on, like the racial climate of our country, right? And so I've really been thinking about collective trauma and just wanted to define that. So collective trauma is the psychological effect shared by a large group in response to a traumatic event. And it can disrupt our sense of self-identity, our sense of community. It can challenge our existing belief systems and the way we understand the world and humanity. And the impacts are widespread and diffuse, and you don't even need to be very close to the traumatic event to be feeling the impact of the traumatic event. And so one thing that we've found is that participation on the larger macro level helps us to name trauma, and that can help us to confront and resolve trauma, right? And so rituals of making, sharing, and viewing art can support a collective process, and that helps expose the issues, naming it is the first part, right? And then potentially heal individuals and communities. So yesterday on social media, on Instagram, there was a post by Chiara Francesca, who's a cultural worker. And I don't know if you can see this, it might be too small, but it says, just remember, we haven't even processed any of this shit yet. And it just hit me so hard as a therapist and a human who has been experiencing the last year and a half. And I really appreciated this statement, talking about how there's this push for us to kind of like not even process, but get right back into it, right? So capitalism will try and fool us into thinking that it didn't even happen. The pandemic, the uprising, the illnesses, the police violence and repression, the confinement, the isolation, the torn apart communities, the loss of loved ones, pushing us into a forced normal, which means working, producing, consuming, buying. We must pause. And remember, we haven't even processed any of this shit yet. We cannot process things as we're going through them while our nervous system is stuck in survival mode trying to get us out alive. And so I just felt like, well, that really names it, right? So I included this. I encourage you to check out her page and also to see the rest of this post. This is just part of the caption. I didn't have room for the whole thing. But I think this need to pause feels especially important now as vaccination is happening, and there's this rush to get back to normal, and for folks who are saying, wait, normal wasn't great, so we have a chance to make things different. And I think this ties into textiles in some ways, and how textiles were used in the last year as consciousness raising and for action. So in terms of textiles in the last year and a half, there have been a lot of virtual communities, and this idea of third space, so not work or home, but community spaces that have been taken up in virtual spaces, creating from home. So this merging of private and public, what does that mean? I'm still trying to figure that out. I think we're still figuring that out. Learning new skills and hobbies, for sure sourdough bread was like pandemic 1.0, and I've joked that quilting was pandemic 2.0. It just seems like, people are learning new skills and there are trends in that. And then also the digital divide, right? So I think that there's an assumption that everything moved online. In some ways it's wonderful because there are people joining us from Poland and Mexico City and all over today. That's amazing. And also for the folks that I work with in my community art therapy practice, the Craft Activism group, we haven't met since last March because not everyone has access to technology, and for a range of reasons, age, socioeconomic status, access to education about them. So, that's not the reality for everyone. Also, not everyone has been working from home. So thinking about who has needed to continue working outside of the home and how that relates to equity and inequity. And also this assumption of hobbies, and needing to remember that some of these hobbies that we've been taking up or have more time for are also low-paying exploitative jobs for other people, sometimes in different parts of the world, especially the global south. So I'm thinking of like garment manufacturing. So I want us to hold all this complexity because craftivism isn't totally straightforward, and I think we need to be able to hold all of it to really try to understand what's been happening with our textile making in the last year and a half. So I think the first thing that most of us noticed when the pandemic started was mask making, right? And this mutual aid that emerged early in the pandemic as people came together to make PPE for frontline workers. So I'll talk about a couple of projects. One is the Auntie Sewing Squad that was started by Christina Wong. And so they say in March 2020, when the US government failed to provide personal protective gear during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Auntie Sewing Squad emerged. Founded by performance artist Christina Wong, the mutual aid group sewed face masks with a bold social justice mission to protect the most vulnerable and most neglected. So this was all volunteered, right? It was a mutual aid effort. And in total, there were over 800 sewists. They made over 300,000 masks. They also did coat drives for Standing Rock and Navajo Nation. They had 6 vans bringing supplies to Navajo Nations. And they are creating a book that is coming out soon. That's the Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice. So I really appreciate how this shows the intersections of all of the things that have been coming up in the last year. We can't talk about the pandemic without talking about racial justice, and then looking at all of the issues that have been coming up. This is the Boston Area Mask Initiative. So on the left is a drop box for masks at my local craft store, Gather Here, which is a wonderful place that you should check out. They have a virtual shop. But this was a group of Boston-based crafters and makers who volunteered to make masks for medical and essential workers and at-risk populations affected by the COVID crisis. And so they made and distributed over 50,000 fabric face masks. And their site says they were sewn in memory of those lost, sewn in honor of those struggling to survive, sewn to commemorate the hours of unpaid labor of thousands, maybe millions of women around the world who cut, stitched, threaded, elastic, packed, delivered, and repeated this every day, week, month of 2020. And on the right-hand side is a quilt they made from scraps. So this quilt is made from scraps that people had from making the masks. So next I wanted to just talk about how crafting happens, often virtual, right? So there were virtual workshops, classes, talks, stitch and bitch groups, craft nights, which is, I have a link later that I will put in the chat, which is a movement created by an art therapist, Janice Timbodos, about small community-based art spaces that are inviting for everyone, that focus on each one, teach one, everyone having skills to share and value to contribute. And a lot of this moved online. So this image is a quilt that I'm almost done making, that I started in a class that I was taking, a narrative embroidery class, I think, in November. And so it was just all these cords. It started because we had to just, I think, pick something up and start stitching it. I think that was the prompt. But anyway, I was just thinking about the cords. All the cords I was so dependent on all day, because all of a sudden I was teaching art therapy online, I was seeing clients online, I was seeing my friends online, I was crafting online, everything was happening online. This is veering from textiles, but fiber arts, I'll say, because it's paper. This is a project that my husband, Mike, and I started last summer called "We Hope This Finds You as Well as Can Be Expected," which is the phrase that we just heard in every email, I think, collectively. And so we said to our friends, we just put this out on social media, hey, things are pretty rough right now. We're all lonely and overwhelmed, worried about our friends, our families, our jobs, our communities, our country, the world. We thought a zine exchange might help us all connect by sharing a little bit about what we've been experiencing or thinking about during this pandemic. It could be like a pandemic time capsule. So we were kind of focusing on that. And afterwards, after reading all the zines, we really recognized that it was also a form of self-care and community care, more than we realized when we started the project. So many folks, about 50 people, I think we capped it at 50. So we had 50 people sign up. I think 48 people submitted their zines, which is an excellent return rate. And what happened is everyone made a little zine out of a one piece of 8.5 by 11 paper about their experience during the quarantine. and made 50 copies, sent them to us. We bundled them into these little packs and sent them out to people. And it was just a way to share what's going on, where have people been at, how are you doing? But so many people shared how they had been feeling isolated or stuck creatively, and that this really felt like a productive way to engage, to process, and sort of a bright spot. And it really, I mean, I was like weeping at some of the ones we received. It was really moving. Here is an image on the left of one of the participants, also an art therapist, with the zines that she received from this all spread out. And on the right is a clip from a zine I made, Ambient Sameness. I really wanted to process, what is this pandemic like for therapists? What is it like for me right now? Like, how can I slow down and kind of process what this has been like? And how can I reach out to other therapists? So I solicited input from colleagues about, what has this process been like for you? And so this is a page, one of my friends talking about, you know, how this shift in really being in the same situation in a lot of ways and not in other ways with our clients during a pandemic, and what that means, and how we're all sort of trying to make it back to shore together. So that was really moving. Wanted to talk a little bit about the Social Justice Remembrance Project, which is a quilt block community art project that was started by Social Justice Sewing Academy, which is run by Sarah Trail. So usually they do in-person workshops with youth, and because COVID put a stop to that, they started this project, and it was to create activist art banners for local and national organizations who have requested creative statements to publicly display that represent solidarity as well as remembrance. So George Floyd is represented on this block, but people range from like highly publicized cases to cases, individuals that have been lost that we might not have heard of. But the idea was their names and identities will be displayed during community activism events to remind the world that their lives mattered. And so there are different categories of banners for folks who have been murdered by authorities, so looking at police brutality or murder, community, victims of gang violence, neighborhood or family violence, race, so hate crimes or racially motivated murder, and then also looking at gender and sexuality, so violence against the LGBTQI plus community, domestic violence, missing, murdered Indigenous women. And so people sign up. Social Justice Sewing Academy will send you the name of an individual, and then you do research and create a design. And so this one was for George Floyd on the next page. This is for Nina Pop, who is a trans woman who was murdered. And I really found the description here moving, in that the person who created it, who's anonymous, said, "I specifically requested a trans person for this project, not only to remember them, but to honor all of the trans people who have helped to write my life story. So for justice." Another project for remembrance and also for activism were these postcards for Breonna Taylor, organized by Melissa Blount. So basically just asking people to stitch Breonna's name on a postcard for the Attorney General of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, and she provided the address to his office and also his home. And so here are some more cards that were created. And then Badass Cross Stitch, Shannon Downey, who some folks might be familiar with, created this tutorial of like, here's how you do it. And they both hosted online stitching events. And so I really liked watching how those were craftivists supporting each other around this, trying to raise awareness and put some pressure on the Attorney General. Heather Schultz started a project called, she started something called Situation Report, where she was just cross-stitching the number of cases reported each day and then deaths. And then it got to be such a big project that she made it a community-based project called Stitching the Situation. And so it was this daily cross-stitch documentary of coronavirus case and death counts in the US. And it was a way to record and translate visually through stitch. And so she sent out kits to people. She did some stitching outside with folks. But about this, she said, the act of stitching and creating offers quiet, meditative time to grieve. Stitching alongside others has a long tradition, one often saturated with grief and loss. Stitching the Situation invites people from all over the country to stitch a block representing one day's date in a collaborative act of working together while physically apart. So here are two blocks. The one on the left, Heather created, and unfortunately her uncle passed away a couple of days later of COVID, and so she's dedicated this project to him. And the one on the right is one that her mother created while she was recovering from surgery. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the election and some of the projects around the election. One was Textiles for MVP, which is Movement Voter Project. And it's interesting because this was a form of activism, not about creating art, but about raising money through selling art. So, so a group of textile artists, Chi Nguyen, Jen Hewitt, Erin Riley, and Betty Farrell, wanted to raise money for grassroots organizations so that organizations could determine for themselves how best to invest in their community's future around the election. So they created this sort of fundraising auction that was all online, where people, they created the project, they created this sort of template, and then people could just post their work and have auctions on their Instagram pages or on their website. So it wasn't one big auction, but all these little auctions happening everywhere. And so over $50,000 were raised by over 100 artists, selling, I think, 333 works. I'm not sure if that's the final number. And that was donated to Movement Voter Project, which is a group that offers fundraising to support to help donors connect with community-based organizations in battleground states. So interesting to look at how material support, material meaning money, factored into this project. This is Diana Weimar's Tiny Pricks project, which has been going on for about 3 years now. It's a public art project that she created where contributors around the world are stitching Donald Trump's words into textiles, and for the purpose of creating this material record of his presidency and a movement against it. And she talks about how social media can be so impermanent and that stitching makes it permanent. So it's sort of like a counterbalance to the speed at which social media moves. And so she says that it's the largest textile Trump protest ever, with over 1,000 participants globally. My guess is that has grown since that was written, and that the series will go strong until Trump is out of office. So here's one that she stitched. And it's interesting because as the election happened, the contributions have changed because he is no longer in office. So here's a quote by Kimberly Crenshaw that I stitched on November 7th or 8th, just kind of making sense of everyone's response to the election, and when Biden was officially called as the next president, and sort of looking at the need to keep pushing for radical change, and that my fears about people slipping back into kind of complacency. So So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Disability Culture Crip and Ally Care Exchange. This was facilitated by Sandy Yee and Catherine Haupt, who are two art therapists living in Chicago. And this is a public art project to connect disabled people and artist allies in an art and care exchange during challenging times. And definitely COVID has been especially challenging for disabled folks in terms of potentially increased vulnerability to the disease, as well as how cases were triaged initially. So the idea of this project was for mutual care, community care, and also for disabled people to be witnessed and to take up space, to claim space. And so I was partnered with someone also called Lauren. And this image is of an embroidery I made. It's actually a still from a video of an embroidery I made. And we talked a lot about internalized ableism and how it relates to the pressure to be productive and these larger themes of internalized capitalism. And so looking at myself as someone who's always identified as non-disabled, but has a chronic illness that did make me more susceptible to COVID, and kind of how I was making sense of that experience. And she was in a similar situation. And so we were trying to work through that together and witness each other. So this is another still from that video. And on the right is a still that I embroidered from the video that she made. So we each made artwork and shared it with each other and then reflected back to each other. So this idea of mutual care and witnessing, virtual connection during the pandemic, which is something that the disability community has already been really adept at, that I think everyone has benefited from and learned from during the pandemic. This is the Collective Mending Sessions, which is a project by Catherine Reinhardt. And she says it's a series of socially engaged workshops centered on collaboratively mending a quilt. And we do this through partnering with community organizations to host workshops, including basic mending instruction and then building community through the shared task of stitching. And so I just thought this idea of mending was apt for right now. And of course, the classic Zoom screenshot where Caroline had to start doing this virtually. So she cut up the quilts and sent them to volunteers. All right, I'm being mindful of time. So I'm gonna go through this next one a little bit quickly. The last project I wanted to talk about was the COVID-19 Global Quilt. This was started by Australian craftivists Tal Fitzpatrick and Kate Just. It's an online quilt project. And so it began in April of 2020, and it just started with an open call for submissions. And it's become this digital exhibition where when you go to the Instagram page, it's just this long three across, and then just sort of endless stream of images that people have sent in. And so it's really this real-time collective look at what's happening. And lots of the themes and topics repeat over the course of that. And so it really, I think, is showing not just what relates to COVID, but what has been happening across the world in the last year that is intersecting with COVID. So I'll show a few squares. Love this one. Someone teaching their mom how to use Facebook Messenger, but really speaking to, this person is in Australia, her elderly mother is in the UK, and they're trying to figure out how to connect. I think just this expression of hopelessness is really important to be able to share. I'm looking at statistics. this is a square I made, which I realized as I was putting together this presentation I never uploaded. But also what made me think of it was that last square, but the tally marks. This was made right before Thanksgiving, where there were statistics and news stories about, like, you know, I think it was like 2.5 jumbo jets worth of people passing away from COVID. And so the statistic really stuck out to me, and I was navigating not spending the holiday with family and different friends and families' levels of comfort around COVID protocols and safety. And this is a way that I just kind of processed that. I really liked this square created by an essential worker in solidarity with all our other workers. And then this one, connection. I'm talking about restrictions on movement, physical distancing, and the way that's impacting how people connect with each other. Okay. So, in sum, when I tried to take a step back and put this all together, this is what I came up with. So in this year, we created Textiles to make meaning, right? So using that slow process to process feelings and emotions, to make sense and meaning of unusual circumstances, to understand our lived experience, to document and memorialize. So really as this time capsule to document what's happening, as well as a way to memorialize people we've lost, to take care of ourselves and each other. So using the sensory process that's relaxing, that's grounding, as a way to take care of ourselves, as a way to witness others, as a way to engage in collective care. Educating and mobilizing. So sharing our social, cultural, and political realities, rallying our friends and family to care about issues important to us, engaging critical consciousness, speaking out and being heard, finding agency and empowerment, engaging in collective resistance to social and political oppression. And on the right is this shirt created by Namita Gupta Wiggers, who is a crafter, and wrote about this shirt. She started taking a line for a walk, which is a quote by Pope-Leighey, I think, and just using stitching as a grounding practice over the year. And then she said she was waiting and watching and waiting and watching, and that it became this marker of time and evidence for how lucky her family has been to be able to stay home and be safe when so many have not, and that there's so much grief in these times, punctures and stitches. So looking at the metaphor of the stitching process for what's been happening. And then she embroidered these Band-Aids with the dates that each of her family members got vaccinated. It's really, really moving. Okay, so anecdotally, I put this out on Instagram yesterday, just asking people, has craft contributed to a sense of healing and or community for you during the pandemic? And so here are some things that people shared. Definitely themes about grounding, regulating, coping with anxiety, connecting to like-minded people, giving and receiving. So again, more collective care there. So I want to be mindful of time. I have a couple more slides. I'll try to get through them pretty quickly so that we can move into Q&A. I just wanted to bring up concerns that have been voiced about craftivism, because I think it's easy to get into like a really kumbaya, feel good space around it, because it can be really exciting, but we also have to look at it with a critical eye and understand it, right? So some of the critiques or concerns about craftivism have been, one, that assumption that crafting is a choice and or leisure. So again, this idea that, work that is unpaid or poorly paid or exploitative for some folks is taken as leisure, and that we can't make the assumption that craft is inherently leisure, because that's not the case for everyone. Some concerns around gender stereotypes, and does it frame women as homemakers? Is that kind of retro and not helpful? The commodification of the DIY and craft movement, and sort of this idea of creating this cutesy approach to selling craft back to women as a form of artificial liberation. Issues related to exclusivity. I think there's the assumption that craft, because it is not necessarily fine arts based, is more inclusive, and assumptions about the fact that because it has an activist, because activism is the title, that it's inclusive. But the Pussy Hat Project showed us that that wasn't the case, that there were many people who felt excluded from that, particularly women of color and trans women. And so important to look at some of our assumptions. So I really think that we're at this important point in craftivism. Can we truly make it inclusive and equitable and just, and make sure that everyone is welcome, that we don't appropriate other cultures, that we try to reuse or limit consumption? There are lots of important ethical considerations. I really recommend Shannon Downey of Badass Cross Stitches started a series of panel talks called Disrupting Craftivism, and said that she would like to see critical exploration and rigor put to the movement, and that's some of the critique around craftivism, that hasn't happened yet. And so I really encourage you to check out that series. So just a last thought before we move into Q&A is, what does it mean to engage in these practices in an ethical way? So I love this ethics of care that Savneet Talwar and Rachel Wallace, who wrote a chapter in my book, Craft in Art Therapy, wrote about what are the key things we have to look at before beginning projects, especially in communities we don't belong to, right? So looking at what is consent and the power of language. How is the project centering the voices of the community? Who benefits from the project? What is the risk of harm to those being represented or participating in the project? What policies and systemic view does the project address? So I think that's a really helpful framework. And then on the right is this image of the Stitching Together Good Practice Guidelines. Amy Twigger-Hollyroyd and Emma Shercliffe from the UK put together these guidelines that they say are written for people who facilitate participatory textile making workshops and projects. Whether professional textile practitioners, artists, academic researchers, people that work in museums or galleries, community activists, amateur enthusiasts, or anyone else, they say. And so I highly recommend that. I have that link, which I will put in the chat. But I'm going to wrap up there. Just want to say thank you. And I'll turn it over to Susan, who I think has been monitoring the chat. I'll just keep this up for a moment in case anyone wants to take down some contact info, and then I'm going to stop sharing so we can chat.
Well, thank you, Lauren. It was such an impactful and interesting presentation, packed with so many takeaways. I know I have them, and I'm sure others on this call have. Lots of food for thought, and it will surely spark a lot of thought about how to creatively process multiple levels of crisis, as well as what we want to say. But, just what you kicked it all off with, that everyone is inherently creative, is kind of a really nice place to start. So many other things that were strong takeaways, but we are unfortunately out of time for Q&A. But what I think we can do is post the questions. We'll send them to you, Lauren, and then you can give us your response, and we'll post the video in a couple of weeks, and we'll post the some of the responses to these questions. I do want to right now give a very hearty thank you to Trinity Yancik, who is our program assistant at Woodlawn, for her outreach to program presenters. And it was Trinity who brought us Lauren today. So as well as the other presenters that you see Woodlawn providing these noon hours for. So continue, please, all of you who come and support this programming, but also, let us know what it is you'd like to see, how we can best meet your needs, and then definitely stay tuned on the website. We've always got just a runway of great programming, again, thanks to Trinity. So with that, Lauren, really, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to wish...
So sorry, I was looking at my timer, but I forgot that we had some stuff at the beginning. So I thought we had like 5 or 7 minutes.
We're really good. What we'll probably do is just find a way to bring you back another time, and then. But again, we've got these comments, and you'll see lots of lovely comments as well. And once again, from all of us, thank you so much, Lauren, both for what you've done here for us and with us today, but also what you're doing out there in the world. I'll just kind of leave with one of the comments saying that there was so much that you work with, and how do you handle all the emotions that kind of are flowing from the artist and flowing from you. So I'll leave you all to kind of think about that. Please reach out to us, everyone, to tell us how we can best do this and serve you. And in the meantime, we are at Monday, so that means a full, lovely week ahead for everyone, I hope. And take good care, all. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And please reach out to me if you have questions. Sorry that I did not leave time for Q&A.
Perfect presentation. We needed to hear all of it. Thanks, everyone.